everyone. As you may have noticed, I've rearranged the syllabus so that we're doing all of our Oscar Wilde at once. We're using 3 weeks of Oscar Wilde as a transition between what has been our primary focus up until this point, Victorian gender, and what I'd like to be our focus for the second half of the semester, which is Victorian sexuality. Obviously, these two topics are linked, as we've already seen, and we'll continue to see that in the Wilde plays we read. I'm going to try to do 2 things today as briefly as possible in today's lecture. The first is to lay a little bit of groundwork for how we think about Victorian sexuality and specifically homoeroticism. The second is to give you a very, very brief biography of Oscar Wilde. So to start with the sexuality study side of things, one hopeful place to start would be to think about the forces in Victorian England that regulated sexuality, the institutions that told people this is what you can do and this is what you cannot do. Prior to the 1800s, there were laws against sodomy and the church condemned it, but in the 1800s, these regulations became much more strongly codified in society. And it's helpful to think of this happening in 3 main areas: religion, medicine, and the law. In terms of religion, condemnation of male homoeroticism had been a theme and continued in the 19th century, but it might be worth noting that anti-Catholic rhetoric in the 19th century was especially strong in its portrayal of Catholicism as a sensual, depraved, and often homoerotic institution. And it might be argued that this language created an increased sense of condemnation of homoeroticism within the Anglican Church. But it was in the medical and legal field where the 19th century made especially significant moves towards the regulation of sexuality. Sexology became an intentional field of study. Scientists literally filled books with names of sexual deviancies and descriptions thereof. Women who were perceived to have strong sexual urges were considered nymphomaniacs. Sexual attraction to the same sex or sex acts between members of the same sex at that time was called inversion, and masturbation for both men and women was considered dangerous and unhealthy. Various devices were created to prevent male children from masturbating, and medical procedures were invented to cure women of the desire to masturbate. Michel Foucault argues that until something has a name, it doesn't have very significant power, but once you name it, people can talk about it and it becomes a social force. This is what was happening in the 19th century in Britain. There's a reason why I talk about homoeroticism in the 19th century as opposed to homosexuality. Most sexuality studies scholars prefer the term homoeroticism when discussing Victorian sexuality, because the term homosexuality didn't really exist yet. It wasn't widely used until a few decades into the 20th century. But also the idea of who you are attracted to, that concept has significant meaning on a personal and social level, is something that's really developed and grown throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. Well, during the 20th century, much of it became common for homosexuality to be an important label to describe how a person thought of themselves and how society viewed them. That hasn't always been the case. And at least not, I'd say broadly speaking, it hasn't always been the case. Homoeroticism, too, I think as a term, allows for greater inclusion. For one thing, it doesn't assume that someone who's attracted to members of their same sex is exclusively attracted to them. It has a little bit more flexibility in that sense. I also think it allows more room for those who are attracted but might not act upon attraction, or those who fall along an asexual spectrum. Another thing that suggests that things were changing in the 19th century is the fact that the law changed so that people could be prosecuted more broadly for same-sex sexual acts and attractions. Prior to 1885, you couldn't prosecute someone unless you had proof that they had committed what was called at the time sodomy. So obviously proof of that was hard to come by, and also the law very narrowly limited which sex acts could be prosecuted, and Victorians thought that that was a problem. In 1885, the Labouchere Amendment changed the law so that any what they called acts of gross indecency could be prosecuted. This meant that anything sexual between two men became illegal. Oscar Wilde would be sentenced for 2 years of prison under the Labouchere Amendment. Having grown up in Ireland, he transferred to Oxford, where he studied at Magdalen College, wrote poetry, and converted to the art philosophy of aestheticism. Aestheticism is a movement that encourages people to stop thinking about art and literature in terms of good and bad or right and wrong, and instead focus on whether beautiful and powerful things succeed in providing and creating beautiful and powerful emotions. Walter Pater was a professor at Oxford while Wilde was there, and he would argue that the search for new noble sensations was in fact the goal of life and could be found in art, nature, architecture, and literature. He wrote, "To burn always with this hard, gem-like flame, to maintain this ecstasy, is success in life." Wilde's writing then sought to create emotions that were neither good nor bad, but were rather powerful, new, and exciting. His social comedies would criticize a Victorian society that was obsessed with rules and regulations and had lost sight of sincere human feeling, the importance of art over artifice, and true emotion. He became especially popular as a playwright, writing 5 plays. Only 4 of those were produced in his lifetime. Salome, for reasons that will probably seem clear to you when we read it, was censored. Wilde married, and he did have 2 children, but the real passion of his life was a younger man, Lord Alfred Douglas. Wilde would leave his family for weeks, sometimes with intention of running away with Bosie, which was what everyone called Douglas, and sometimes with the intention of just getting away to get some of his work and writing done. But even then, Bosie would often follow him, interrupt Wilde's work, and spend all of his time with Wilde. Bosie was a bit spoiled by Wilde's own account and by Wilde's friends' accounts. Wilde spent a lot more money than he actually had on this young man, and he often neglected his work in order to spend time with him. They were often in public together, and this angered Bosie's father, the Marquess of Queensberry. Pardon me, I've got a puppy over here who wants to be a part of this video. Say hi, Samwise. Okay, we're good. We're getting back. So Bosie's father, the Marquess of Queensberry, was very upset about all the time that Wilde and his son were spending together in public. And so he kind of had this growing animosity towards Wilde, and eventually showed up one night, story has it, to the premiere of The Importance of Being Earnest with a handful of vegetables they wanted to throw at Oscar Wilde. And the doorman, like any sensible person, decided not to let the angry vegetable-bearing man into the theater and sent him away. Queensberry went to Wilde's club and left a note that said to Oscar Wilde, technically a sodomite is what he wrote. He was trying to write sodomite. He didn't have great spelling. And when Wilde received the note, Bosie encouraged him to sue Queensberry, and Wilde was reluctant but eventually gave in to Douglas's demands. He sued Queensberry for libel, but turns out that it's a really bad idea to sue someone for saying something that is actually true. The court quickly dismissed the libel case and turned it around on a case against Wilde for acts of gross indecency. Wilde was condemned to 2 years of hard labor in prison. In prison, he wrote what I consider to be his greatest work of all. Might be alone in that opinion, but he wrote a letter to Alfred Douglas entitled De Profundis. It's about a 50-page work. In it, he argues for a new understanding of the Christian religion. Not one that seeks to condemn and control, but rather one that views Christ as the ultimate artist who calls away from competition and regulation and condemnation, and instead towards beauty and forgiveness and empathy. Really the ultimate artist goal of being able to feel on behalf of others and act well because of that feeling. He writes of Christ's morality. His morality is all sympathy, just what morality should be. The only thing that he had ever said was, her sins are forgiven her because she loved much. It would have been worthwhile dying to have said it. His justice is all poetical justice, exactly what justice should be. The beggar goes to heaven because he has been unhappy. I cannot conceive a better reason for his being sent there. The people who work for an hour in the vineyard in the cool of the evening receive just as much reward as those who have toiled there all day long in the hot sun. Why shouldn't they? Probably no one deserved anything. Or perhaps they were a different kind of people. I want us to think about how we see Wilde responding to the limits created by institutional religion, medicine, and law throughout his writing and the attitudes he communicates throughout those writings. I like to think that we are progressing from Wilde's more fun and light-hearted comedy this week, The Importance of Being Earnest, to his most serious drama, Salome, in 2 weeks. But I think that we can make so many important connections even within the comedies. So today I'd like you to comment in response to the question posed after this lecture in Icon. Please also remember to respond to the question of the day in the discussion forum. On Wednesday, please read the article I've assembled on masculinity and earnest in popular culture, and then make sure to go back to that question of the week, I said day earlier, question of the week forum and respond to 2 of your classmates. Then on Friday, we're going to have our Zoom conference during classes' regularly scheduled time. If you're not able to come to that conference, please contact me for an alternate assignment, preferably before the conference begins, but definitely before the end of the week. So Sunday night is kind of the deadline for that, though of course I can make exceptions for extreme emergency situations. I hope you're all well. I miss you, but I really look forward to seeing you all on the Zoom call on Friday. Have a good week. Thanks. Bye.